It was supposed to be an accident. That's what the husband said when the sirens faded and the house fell quiet again. He stood barefoot on cold tile, his voice steady, his hands clean, telling police that his wife had slipped. A tragic fall, one wrong step in the dark. These things happen, he said, and for a moment the story almost worked. Because America is built on believing the familiar, trusting the man who looks like every other man on your street. But accidents don't whisper back when the room is empty. And this one left a sound behind it that never stopped echoing. And in the small towns scattered across this country, history doesn't announce itself. It hides in kitchen drawers, in old photographs curled at the edges, in marriages that look ordinary from the outside. This story begins in one of those places, where neighbors wave, lawns are trimmed, and no one expects the ground beneath them to open. The husband had a name people trusted. He coached youth teams. He fixed things around the house. He told jokes that made others feel safe. And when his wife died, the town mourned with him, because grief, when performed well, is contagious. And he said she fell down the stairs. He said he heard the thud and ran. He said he tried to help. The words were rehearsed enough to sound natural, but not enough to sound true. Still, the first officers on scene saw what they expected to see. A woman at the bottom of the staircase, her body twisted in a way that suggested gravity, not cruelty. There were no obvious signs of a struggle, no broken furniture, no shattered glass, just silence, and a husband who seemed shattered in all the right ways. But death has a memory, and the body, when listened to carefully, tells stories the living cannot control. The autopsy was routine. At least that's what everyone believed when the medical examiner zipped the bag closed. Another tragic statistic, another line in the archives. Except this examiner had seen too many accidents to ignore the patterns. Bruises that bloomed in the wrong places, damage that didn't match the fall, marks that whispered of hands, not stairs. And this is where the story turns, quietly. No headlines yet, no courtroom drama, just a file reopened, a second look taken, and a truth beginning to surface that would rot everything it touched. Because sometimes the most dangerous lies are the ones told calmly, in safe homes, by people who know exactly how much truth the world is willing to hear. And the autopsy room is not a place of drama. There are no raised voices, no accusations, only fluorescent lights and the quiet discipline of observation. This is where stories lose their costumes. When the medical examiner began documenting the injuries, the language was clinical, but the implications were anything but. The bruising along her arms was deep, patterned, inconsistent with a simple fall. Defensive marks, subtle but unmistakable to someone trained to listen to flesh. Her skull told another truth, one impact too many angles that gravity alone could not explain, and the report did not accuse. It didn't need to. It simply disagreed with the husband's version of events. And in that disagreement, a crack appeared in the narrative the town had already accepted. Investigators returned to the house, this time without sympathy clouding their eyes. They measured the stairs, counted the steps, traced the path a body would take if it truly fell. The math didn't add up. The injuries were too focused, too deliberate. Accidents are chaotic. This was not. And they began asking questions again, and the answers didn't change, but their meaning did. The husband repeated his story word for word, as if consistency itself were proof. He spoke of love, of a good marriage, of stress, maybe, but nothing unusual. He never raised his voice, never contradicted himself, and that strangely became part of the problem. People under shock forget details. They stumble, they contradict. He did not. His calmness wasn't comforting anymore. It was rehearsed, and neighbors remembered things they hadn't thought mattered. Late-night arguments muffled by walls. A look on her face that lingered just a second too long when he spoke for her. Small things, American things, the kind you dismiss because acknowledging them would mean admitting how close danger can live to you. A friend recalled her saying she felt trapped, not abused, not threatened, just trapped. As if something heavy was slowly lowering, inch by inch, and the investigators pulled phone records, text messages. A timeline began to form, and it showed gaps the husband couldn't explain. Minutes unaccounted for, calls deleted. A window of time where the story required him to be in two places at once. Still no confession came, just patience. And patience, in cases like this, is a blade. And because murder doesn't always arrive with rage, sometimes it arrives with calculation, with a decision made long before the final act. The autopsy didn't just reveal how she died. It suggested when the truth began to rot, long before the fall, long before the sirens. Somewhere in the quiet spaces of a marriage that looked unremarkable to everyone else. And as the investigation deepened, the house itself began to feel less like a home and more like a witness. Detectives moved slowly through the rooms, not looking for blood or broken objects, but for absence. What was missing? What had been cleaned too well? What no longer felt lived in? In the laundry room, they noticed a half-used bottle of cleaner placed back with unusual precision. In the kitchen trash, an empty container that should not have been empty yet. Small details, meaningless alone, began to gather weight, and they reconstructed the final evening hour by hour. Dinner, television, the quiet rituals of married life that rarely make history. According to the husband, nothing was wrong. They went to bed. She woke first. He heard the fall, but the medical examiner's timeline disagreed. The injuries suggested she was already unconscious when gravity took over, which meant the fall was not the beginning, it was the ending, and pressure mounted, not from the public but from the slow tightening of evidence. Friends were interviewed again, this time with sharper questions, and memory, once invited, does not stay polite. A coworker recalled seeing bruises weeks earlier, brushed off as clumsiness. A sister remembered a phone call that ended abruptly, her voice suddenly cautious, as if someone had entered the room. There was no single moment of terror, only a long erosion of safety, and the husband's past, once unremarkable, was re-examined. Financial stress surfaced, insurance policies taken out quietly, arguments over control, over money, over leaving. He had once joked that he didn't know what he'd do without her. The joke didn't land the same way anymore. Investigators don't fear monsters, they fear patterns, and this pattern was old, older than this marriage, older than this town, and when confronted with the inconsistencies, he didn't explode, he didn't cry. He smiled faintly, as if offended by the suggestion that he could be capable of such a thing. He asked if this was really necessary. He reminded them of his reputation, of his grief, of how much he had already lost. It was almost convincing, because America teaches us that monsters snarl and guilt looks obvious. But the truth was already written, not in words but in tissue and time. The autopsy had turned an accident into a question. The investigation had turned a question into a mirror, and the mirror was beginning to reflect something the husband could no longer control. Because when a lie is told long enough, it doesn't just collapse. It decays, and the smell eventually reaches everyone, and the arrest did not come with drama. No flashing lights in the driveway, no neighbors watching from behind curtains. It came quietly, the way the truth often does when it's already done the damage it needs to do. The husband was asked to come in, just to clarify a few things. He agreed without hesitation. People who believe their lies are airtight often mistake cooperation for immunity, and inside the interview room, time stretched. Hours passed. Questions were asked again, then asked differently. The same story was told again and again, until repetition began to sound like erosion. Investigators laid the evidence out slowly, not as accusations but as facts. The injury patterns, the timeline, the insurance policy that activated only in the event of accidental death, the phone activity that placed him awake, moving alert long after he claimed to be asleep, and he listened, he nodded, and when silence fell, it became heavy, not the silence of confusion, but the silence of calculation. When he finally spoke, his voice changed, not louder, not angry, but thinner. The cracks appeared in what he said, not how he said it. He corrected himself, added details he hadn't mentioned before, adjusted the order of events, small repairs to a story that no longer held its shape. And prosecutors would later say this was the moment the case truly turned. Not because he confessed, he never did, but because he revealed the one thing he had tried hardest to hide: intent. In explaining too much, he exposed motive, control, fear of being left, fear of losing the life that depended on her presence. This was not a crime of passion, they argued. This was a decision, made quietly, rehearsed mentally, executed behind closed doors, and the charge was murder. And when it was read aloud, the word seemed to hang in the air longer than it should have. Murder. Not accident, not misfortune. Murder committed in a place the victim believed was safe. The town reacted the way towns always do, first with disbelief, then with distance. People spoke of him in the past tense now, as if separating themselves could undo proximity. But the most haunting absence was hers. In court filings, she became the victim. In exhibits, a body. In headlines, a name paired with a photograph chosen by someone else. The fullness of her life, the plans, the fears, the slow realization that something was wrong, was reduced to evidence. That is the final theft in crimes like these. Not just life, but narrative. And as the trial approached, one question lingered beneath everything else, unspoken but ever present. How many times had the truth almost escaped before it was finally forced into the light? And the trial unfolded the way buried histories often do, slowly, reluctantly, as if the past itself were resisting exposure. There were no shocking confessions, no sudden reversals, just experts, documents, and a methodical dismantling of a lie that had once seemed solid. The medical examiner returned to the stand, this time translating science into certainty. The injuries were not accidental. The timing was not random. The cause of death was homicide. Each sentence stripped another layer of comfort from the room, and the defense tried to restore the old story. They spoke of stress, of misinterpretation, of how grief can look like guilt when viewed without compassion. They reminded the jury that no one had seen the act itself. No weapon had been found, no confession recorded, and for a moment, that doubt hovered, because America loves the idea that without a smoking gun, certainty is impossible. But the prosecution understood something older. That truth does not require spectacle. It requires coherence. And the husband's story, when placed beside the evidence, could not stand on its own. They showed how the fall was staged after the fatal injury, how the stairs became a prop, how the call to emergency services came not in panic, but in preparation, the pauses in his speech, the phrasing, the choice of words that suggested foresight, not shock, and witnesses spoke softly about the woman she had been, careful, quiet, afraid to name what she sensed but could not yet prove. One message, recovered from an old device, cut deeper than any photograph. She had written that she felt like she was disappearing inside the house, not leaving, not dying, disappearing. A slow erasure that no one noticed until it was complete. And this is where the story becomes uncomfortable, not because of violence but because of familiarity, because nothing about this case required a monster, only entitlement, only fear, only the belief that another human being exists to preserve your version of life. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? And when the verdict came, it was delivered without ceremony. Guilty. The word landed like a closing door. The husband showed no visible reaction, no collapse, just stillness, as if even now he believed the world had misunderstood him. Sentencing would come later. Years would be assigned. Numbers meant to measure the unmeasurable, but no sentence could restore what was taken. Not just a life, but the truth of it. The hidden fear, the quiet warnings, the reality that some histories only surface when it is too late to change them. And after the verdict, the house was sold, fresh paint-covered old walls. New owners moved in unaware of how much silence the rooms had already absorbed. This is how America survives its horrors, by building over them, by treating history like something that can be renovated away. But the past does not leave just because keys change hands. It lingers in records, in court transcripts, in the quiet knowledge carried by those who were close enough to feel it coming. And the husband was sentenced months later. The judge spoke of accountability, of betrayal, of trust weaponized. The sentence was long enough to sound severe, short enough to feel insulting. Years reduced to a number, a life translated into time served. He listened without expression, the same way he had listened to everything else. There was no apology worth recording, no moment of clarity. Some people never confess, not because they don't know the truth, but because admitting it would require surrendering the last thing they believe they own, their self-image. And what remains after cases like this is not closure, but residue. The victim's family carried questions that could never be answered. When did she realize she was in danger? How long did she try to normalize it? How many times did she almost leave? These are not questions courts can resolve. They belong to a deeper archive, the one filled with stories that end too quietly. And across the country, cases like this are filed away under similar language. Domestic incident, suspicious death, reclassified after autopsy. The pattern repeats because the conditions repeat. Trust without witnesses, violence without spectacle. A system that often listens too late. This is not ancient history, it is ongoing, buried beneath normalcy, beneath the idea that danger announces itself, and in the years after, the husband would appeal, he would claim misinterpretation. He would insist on accident until the word lost meaning, but the record would not change. The body had spoken once, clearly, and it could not be silenced again. That is the quiet power of forensic truth. It does not argue, it waits. And then the woman at the center of this story would remain frozen in time, known more for how she died than how she lived. That is the final cruelty of hidden family horror. It steals narrative, it replaces memory with mechanism, and it asks the rest of us to decide whether we are comfortable with how easily safety can be staged. And because if this story feels distant, it's only because you're not standing in the right hallway, not listening to the right silence, not reading the signs we are trained to ignore. History is not always loud. Sometimes it waits for you to look directly at it, and then it asks what you will do with what you now know. And long after the case slipped from headlines, it settled into the deeper archive, the place where American stories go when they are no longer useful as news, but remain essential as warning. Court records yellow, evidence is boxed, lives move forward, yet the truth of what happened does not fade. It becomes quieter, more dangerous, because silence is where repetition is born. And what this story leaves behind is not just the image of a husband who lied or a woman who died. It leaves a pattern, one that stretches back through decades of similar cases, hidden behind words like accident, misfortune, misunderstanding. The historian's role is not to accuse the past, but to recognize its echoes. And this echo is unmistakable. A private space treated as a blind spot, trust mistaken for immunity, familiarity used as camouflage, and the most unsettling part is not the violence itself, but how long it went unnamed. How many systems required absolute certainty before they would listen? How many people sensed something was wrong but lacked the language or the permission to say it out loud? That is how these stories survive, not through brutality alone, but through hesitation, through politeness, through the fear of being wrong. And in old American towns, people like to believe evil comes from elsewhere, from strangers, from outsiders, from places they don't recognize. But the archive tells a different story. It shows us that danger often wears the most trusted face in the room, that the final threat is not chaos, but control exercised patiently, methodically, without witnesses. And this is why cases like this matter long after the sentence is served. Not because they shock, but because they educate. They teach us what to look for when nothing looks wrong. They remind us that the body keeps records the voice cannot. That truth, once uncovered, does not belong to the court alone. It belongs to anyone willing to sit with discomfort long enough to learn from it. And somewhere, right now, another story like this is forming. Not in headlines, but in patterns, in arguments dismissed, in injuries explained away, in silence chosen over confrontation. History will eventually record it. The only question is how late. And you were not supposed to find this story. These archives are not meant for comfort. They are meant for recognition. And now that you've seen what hides beneath the word accident, the past has done its work. And the rest, what you notice, what you question, what you refuse to ignore, that belongs to you.